Happy Sabbath. What a delight it is for me to be here again in these neck of the woods. I love Australia. Australia. A couple of years ago when Nick talked about this, it was just a dream, an idea, but here you are, the fulfillment of a vision that God has given to one person, that collectively we have brought it into being, and I'm so delighted. Well, I was born and raised in Jamaica, and my family, we didn't have television and radio and all of that when I was growing up. My grandmother used to tell me stories, and as a result, I love to tell stories. And I always try to find a story that will illustrate my sermon. But the problem is that the internet is ruining my life, because there's hardly a story that I can tell that you haven't read or forwarded to someone. But I hope this morning this illustration will capture your attention. Not long ago, in a little town called Kilgore in Texas, there was a terrific accident. A man was driving his brand new, very expensive sports car at the top speed the car could go. And when he went around a hairpin bend, the car spun out of control and he crashed into a huge tree across the street from a very busy Shell station. When the car crashed, a good Samaritan from the Shell station ran across the street, pulled him out of the car just seconds before the car just exploded into flames. He carried the broken, bloody body of that injured man across the street like a mother carries a child. And he gently laid him on the ground in the Shell station while others who were there gathered around to see what was going on. The man was unconscious when he laid him on the ground, but after a few seconds, he opened his bloody eyes and he began to scream and groan and scream and groan as he gestured in front of him. One of the Good Samaritans slipped to his knees, tried to listen to hear the words that he was saying. But before he could hear a word, the man had slipped back into unconsciousness. So he looked to see what was this that the man was gesturing at. And when he looked up, he saw a very large Shell sign. The problem was, however, that the S was missing, and it read, "Hell open 24 hours." The poor man had thought that he had died and gone to the place of his worst nightmare. It is true, and it is very obvious, that hell is open 24 hours a day in our world. Just imagine, this year alone, we have heard or experienced killer tornadoes, unprecedented amount of killer tornadoes, catastrophic floods and famines. There has been devastating volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and tsunamis. One tsunami so powerful that it moved the coast of Japan 3 feet inland and shaved off at least 3 milliseconds of our 24-hour day. We no longer have 24-hour days. And it shifted the earth on its axis. So it's obvious that hell is open 24 hours. But the most appalling evidence that hell is open 24 hours is the wrecked lives of men and women who are imprisoned, or the wrecked lives of some of the most powerful people in the world. And all of these people, and I could name names, but it would take all day to name those whose lives have been wrecked because of the presence of sin. And all of these wrecked lives, they lead to wrecked marriages, wrecked families, wrecked hopes, even a wrecked global economy due to greed over need. Yes, hell is open 24 hours a day. But we should not despair. We should not live without hope, as we heard last night. Because even though hell is open 24 hours a day, one day its doors will be shut permanently. And the good news is that heaven is also open 24 hours a day, and its doors will never be shut throughout eternity, because the doors of heaven will be held open by him who said, "Behold, I set before you an open door that no one can shut." Not a single person can shut that door. But it's important for us to remember that Christians, particularly Seventh-day Adventist Christians, we're not immune to the activities of hell. Even now as I speak, the sad saga of some of our fallen leaders are unfolding in our church. This morning I had a phone call from the U.S. where I was told that one of our students in one of our academies in Memphis 2 days ago went into the office and stabbed the principal to death. And that's the big news, the breaking news on CNN in the United States today, that a Seventh-day Adventist student stabbed his principal to death. But praise God, one day hell will be closed and we will be free to live with God in heavenly places forever and ever. Until then, we have a responsibility as called out, chosen men and women who have been selected to gather together the youth of God in this generation. We have a responsibility to live a Christ-like life with humility. We have a responsibility to show the world that when Jesus is present in our lives, there is a difference in our attitude and in our actions. We have a responsibility to obey the commands of God, and not just the Big Ten, but the many other commands that are strewn throughout the Bible, particularly in the New Testament. For example, this command, love one another in the same way that I have loved you, Jesus said. How often we Adventists have forgotten that we should love one another in the same way that Christ has loved us. Perhaps it's because we have not experienced that deep love and we can't give what we don't have. There's another command to which I draw your attention this morning. It's found in John chapter 11, verses 38 and 39. John chapter 11. You know the story, it's the familiar story of the raising of Lazarus. Verse 38, in the middle of the story, tells us that Jesus said, verse 38, Jesus again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb, and now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, remove the stone. And Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 long days. It's very easy for us to pick a few passages and preach on it and forget that the passage came out of a context. And it's important for us to understand the context of this story before we draw meaning for ourselves, before we decide that we will obey God's command and remove the stone. You know the story. I won't read it. It's very familiar. All of us have taught, preached, talked about the resurrection of Lazarus. But this story begins with a very poignant picture. In verse 1 of chapter 11, a certain man was sick. He was weak and feeble on his deathbed when his 2 sisters sent message to Jesus. Now we're told that this man lived in Bethany. And the word Bethany means house of the poor. Bethany, house of the poor. And it's wonderful to know that Jesus makes his best friends among the poor, because some of us, all of us here perhaps, will never be rich, but we're guaranteed the love of Jesus Christ. Isn't that awesome? And so he was sent this message. And we're told 3 times that he loved Lazarus and his sisters. And yet when Jesus heard this message, he did something that is so unlike Jesus, but it's an experience with which we're familiar. When he heard the news, instead of dashing off, instead of rushing to the side of Lazarus, he stayed 2 extra days longer in the place where he was. You know, sometimes when we pray, we don't get an answer right away because Jesus has decided to stay 2 extra days from the point of our desire. Jesus stayed 2 extra days. There's not a single one of us here who would love someone, no matter how great the preaching and how wonderful the fellowship, if you should get a phone call, and God forbid that you should get a phone call during the worship service, but we do. Unfortunately, our phones ring when we're supposed to be worshiping God. But suppose your phone should ring. Wouldn't you, and you heard that someone you loved was very, very sick on the point of death, you would drop everything, dash out of here, and rush to the side of that person. And yet Jesus, who is supposed to have come to seek and save the lost, this Jesus who said that he had come because he loved the world so much, and this Jesus who loved Lazarus more than he loved many others, in a special way, delayed going to Lazarus for 2 long days. Well, the reason is this. In the time of Jesus, they had their own theological conflicts and discussions. There was a conflict about the resurrection. The Sadducees, who were in power, didn't believe that there was a resurrection, and so they taught perversions of this wonderful divine gift of the story of resurrection. And part of what they taught was that if someone died, within 3 days, the people who loved them could gather together and make a big noise. They could beat the pans, the women could do their tongues so that there was a noise, a glossolalia, and the spirit would be driven, the spirit of the dead person would be driven back into the body of that person. But, said they, after 3 days, not even God could raise this person from the dead. And Jesus, knowing that they taught this fallacy, decided that he would break the bonds of that false theology. And so he waited 2 days longer so that he would get there on the 4th day. So this is why Martha said, he's been dead for 4 days and not even God, not even you can bring him back to life. But Jesus, who's the resurrection and the life, he had testified ahead of time when he said to his disciples, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God. And so he showed up to give God the glory, to do what the Jews would consider to be his greatest miracle, to bring back a dead person after 4 days. And when he came to the tomb, he saw that the people were grieving and they were mourning because 3 days had gone by. If you had been here within the 3-day period, you could have done something, but it's too late now. And so Jesus, being deeply moved at this sign and sight of hopelessness among his disciples, not only among the people who had come to grieve, but his own disciples like Martha and Mary. And he grieved. Ellen White said that he grieved and wept because he knew that within a few short months, some of those very people who were there would be killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. He looked at them And then he looked down the passage of time and he saw us worshipers, us who love God, caught in a situation of hopelessness, in a world that is falling apart, in a world that is so broken. And we who believe in Jesus Christ have become hopeless. And he looked and he wept. He wept, waiting for us to grasp the power, to hold on, to claim, to act out, to live out the power that he's invested in us. And then he moved toward the cave, the tomb, and he commanded the community standing around to remove the stone. And that command, the first of three, but this is the one on which we are focusing this morning, that command is relevant for us today. We need to remove the stone of sin that is blocking us from seeing Jesus Christ in the real way that he wants us to see him. And so the command is also for us today. But before we respond to this command, I think it's important that we understand that there are several words for stone in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the word eben is used over 275 times. It describes the stones that God told Moses to cut out of the mountain so that he could write the 10 Commandments with his own fingers. It describes the stone, the memorial stones that the priests wore on their ephod that lit up and gave signal to the responses of God. It describes the 12 memorial stones. Eben describes the 12 memorial stones that Joshua used to mark the place where God had done the tremendous miracle and parted the Jordan so that the people could cross over. The most familiar use of the word eben to us is in the song, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, where we sing in one verse, Here I raise my Ebenezer, hitherto thy help I've come. The word Ebenezer was never intended to be the name of a person. It is two Hebrew words, eben for stone and ezer for help. So when we sing, Here I raise my Eben Ezer, it means that we're saying, in this place, God has done a miracle, and we're raising a stone as a marker. Comes from 1 Samuel 12, verse 7, where Samuel said, Here I raise an Eben Ezer to mark the place of the miracles that God has done for the people of Israel. There are three words for stones in the New Testament. There is Petros. We're all familiar with that, Peter's name, Petros. It describes a little rock or a chip off a big boulder. And this describes was not just Peter's name, but it was his nature, because he was just a little chip who wanted to be a big boulder. There is Cephas, the nickname that Jesus gave to Peter. And Cephas describes a small stone or a pebble that was washed smooth by running water and or polished very hard by the strength of someone who took it and polished it. And isn't it amazing that Jesus gave Peter this name Cephas before he was converted, knowing that there was going to be a time when Peter's presence with him who is the living water would be washed smooth, and later on he would be polished by persecution and trials and tribulations. So he called him Cephas before he was converted. Cephas was a popular stone in the time of Jesus. It was used for both judicially and socially. It was used judicially. A white stone would be given to someone who was acquitted of a crime, but a black Cephas was given to indicate that they would be put to death. A black Cephas was used to mark the days of disasters. A white Cephas was given to guests at a big festival. A white Cephas was given to the winners of the Olympics so that they could use it like we use gift cards nowadays. They could take it to the stores, and whatever they wanted they could have because they were winners. And Jesus said in Revelation 2:17 that there's going to come a day when he comes again, when he's going to give us, who have remained faithful to the end, he's going to give us a white stone, a white Cephas, because he wants to indicate to the principalities and powers, to the evil elements of the air, to the unfallen angels, that we have stayed in the race against sin and we're winners. There's a third stone, the lithos. And that's the one that's used in this passage, where Jesus said, remove the lithos, remove the stone, the heavy stone, the big boulder that was carved out to fit into the mouth of the cave, this big stone that hid the dead from the living, this big stone that kept the stench of the rotting, decaying body behind that stone, the big stone that represents sin in our lives. Jesus said, remove this stone. Remove this stone. Well, it's important to note that Jesus commanded the community to remove the stone. The second command he gave to Lazarus personally, and the third again to the community and Lazarus. But this first one was given to the community because the big stone was moved into place by the community, and it could only be removed by the community. And there are certain impediments in the lives of leaders today that have been placed there by the entire community and can only be removed by the community. There is no other profession than the profession of preaching, of ministry, where unlearned, untaught people think they know better than those who went to school for 20-odd years to learn. And then they say and do things that hinder us from expressing the power that God has given us to seek and save the lost. And so it's in community that some of these stones need to be removed. It's important that we remove this stone. And the reason why it's important that we obey this command, even though it's not part of the Big Ten, it's because this big stone of sin prevents us from seeing and experiencing the power of the real living stone. For Jesus is described in the Bible over and over again as the living stone. He's called the choice stone because he was chosen by the Father before the foundation of the earth to be the choice stone. He's called the smooth stone because he represents that smooth stone that was picked by David out of 5 out of the brook to be a missile to kill the giant. And Jesus has that power to kill the giants in our lives. Jesus is the precious cornerstone, the one Peter talked about in Acts 4, where he said that he was the chief cornerstone whom they rejected. Jesus is the chief cornerstone, and sometimes the chief cornerstone is also a stumbling stone. You know, in the temple in Jerusalem, the cornerstone butted out of the side of the wall where it was placed. And the priests who were familiar with the temple precinct, they would forget that the stone butted out, and they'd be walking busily in their long robes, and they'd trip and fall, and it became a stumbling stone for them. But for those who were visitors and tourists, they would see the stone and they would know to walk around it. And sometimes we get so familiar with the things about Jesus that we trip over it. Jesus is not just the cornerstone. When I consider the metaphors that were used to represent our Master, I decided to look in the dictionary to see if there are some other stones that reflected the character of Jesus. And I found some amazing things. For example, Jesus is like a millstone. A millstone is an unlimited mass of power. And one day he's going to grind the devil to dust. But at the same time, he is the shelter in a storm for sinners who are seeking the peace that passes all understanding. Jesus is like a whetstone. A whetstone is also a grindstone, and it sharpens tools by friction, just as Jesus sharpens sinners into saints and makes us beautiful winners. Jesus is like a lodestone, for he possesses magnetic powers. A lodestone is a magnetic stone, and Jesus is like a lodestone because he said, if I am lifted up, I will draw all men and women to me. Jesus is like a Rosetta Stone. A Rosetta Stone was that which was inscribed with hieroglyphics and hidden in Egypt until it was discovered sometime in the 1700s. You see, our names are written on the heart of Jesus Christ, and he's hidden from our sight until he comes again, and he will shine brighter than the morning star. Jesus is like a touchstone. A touchstone is a black stone related to flint that is formerly used to test and purify gold and silver. And this stone would leave a streak behind if it was a real gold or silver. And in the same way, when Jesus touches our lives, he leaves streaks of grace behind. Jesus is like a flintstone, because just as that massive hard quartz produces sparks when struck by steel, Jesus produces fire in the belly, in the soul, in the heart, and the mind of sinners saved by grace. Jesus is like a marker stone, or Eben Ezer, because he marks out the paths in which we should walk day by day to prevent us from straying from the promised land and going into the sinful, evil places. Oh, how I wish I had time to tell you how Jesus is like the limestone used extensively in building construction, just as his divinity mingles with our humanity to produce strong, stable Christians. I wish I had time to tell you how Jesus is like the sandstone, the sedimentary quartz. How I wish I had time to tell you that Jesus is like the cobblestone that is used to pave streets, because he said, I am the way, walk ye in it. Suffice it to say that Jesus is the foundation stone. And if we do not remove the stone of sin, we will not be able to experience Jesus in these many diverse ways in which he appears to us. So, I ask you this morning, what is your lethos? We all have a lethos. We all have a big stone. Some people have more than one big stones that's preventing them. Some people were born in situations that caused big stones. Some people became Adventists and gathered themselves with a group of people who created big stones. But we all have stones that we need to be removed. And I tell you this, we will not be able to experience the power of Jesus Christ unless we remove this stone. So what is your lethos? Is it pious pretentiousness? You know how we like to walk around like we've always been saved, we've never done anything wrong? Is it pious pretentiousness, particularly on the Sabbath mornings? You know, we fight with our spouses in the room and then we come out, happy Sabbath. What is this stone? Is it lying, cheating? Is it gossiping, criticizing? You know, you can't come without having something negative to say about something that's happening around here. What is the stone that is preventing us from doing the kind of ministry that will turn this world upside down and make young people stand up and listen to what we have to say. What is this stone that's preventing my denomination that I love so much from being the greatest and the best and the most powerful in this 21st century? Let's not worry about the denomination stones. Let's worry about our own stones. And don't try to remove it by yourself. We need help, the prayerful help of one another. And don't think that so-and-so should have been here because this sermon is for them. This sermon is for you and it's for me. Because we're here to hear this, and this is the place and the time that God says, remove the stone. And don't forget that the Holy Spirit is present with us to help us remove this stone. You know, it's really easy for me to fly all the way from America to come and tell you that you have stones and to tell you that you must remove the stone. But I don't want you to think that this is just something that I'm saying because I've been given the privilege of addressing you. I want you to know that I've had to remove stones, and there are more stones that God is working on me because I'm a work in progress. He's not through with me yet. But I want to share with you the story of a huge stone that God removed out of my life, that transformed my life and changed my ministry. You see, I had a stone called anger, cold anger. I could laugh, but my eyes would not betray my heart that was filled with anger. I was angry. I was angry before I was converted, and I continued to be angry after I was converted. And in fact, conversion didn't heal me of this anger. It exacerbated this anger because it was an anger against my own mother. My mother, who brought me into this world, never loved me. I begged for her love. I bought her love. I borrowed her love. I never got her love. There were times when I was a little girl. I remember telling her when I was about 7 or 8 years old, when my cousins took me from the home into the banana walk in the trenches and molested me sexually. And I remember telling her, Mom, this is what they did to me, and she spanked me, and she said, it's because you're a bad girl. I remember that she had never hugged me. Perhaps she did, but I have no memory of a hug or a kiss from my own mother. And I became angry. Every year of my life, I grew angrier. And then when she became older, she had several strokes. And these strokes caused her to be incontinent and impossible to live on her own. And I, as the oldest child, was required to look after her. So when I moved to California, I invited her to come and live with me so that I could care for her. And I'm really glad that I did. For 3.5 years, I had her living with me. But the first 3 or so years, they were terrible. They were agony. I would try to help her in the car, and she would say to me, you've got to do this because I brought you into the world. I would say to her, Mom, can you just tell me once that you love me? And she'd say, no, I can't. I would buy her gifts. Whenever I traveled, I brought her gifts. She would give them away. I brought her expensive clothes. She'd throw them on the floor in the closet. There was nothing that I could do to get this woman to love me. And I was angry. I was angry, and I was the pastor of a church where about 1,500 people showed up every Sabbath to worship. And I had to get up and preach about the love of Jesus Christ when I couldn't feel the love of my own mother in my heart. We had 2 worship services, one at 8:30, and I usually left my home at 7 o'clock. During the week, I had someone who helped me take care of my mother, but on weekends, because they were Adventists, I had the responsibility of looking after my mother myself. And I remember one particular morning, I dressed her and placed her in the den as I went to get myself ready. And I could tell from the pungent odor that came wafting down the hallway that something had happened. She had an accident. But when I went into the room, I saw that she had taken off all of the materials that I had put on her. And she had daubed the filth on the floor and on the chairs and everywhere. And I said, "Ma, I'm late. Why?" And she said, "Because I brought you into the world and you have to do this." And I was so angry. I was beyond anger. I was filled with rage. I grabbed her by the back of her neck. I dragged her down the hallway. I screamed. I shoved her in the bathtub. I turned on the hot water.